It's been an incredible day of content. I'm fired up, and we're not done yet. So I'm here with 4 really inspiring leaders to share their personal experiences from their first years as managers. So you're going to hear from a couple of folks today. Ford, who's on the solutions engineering team at Cisco, Liz, who manages the solutions engineering team at Slack, Payal, who manages the solutions engineering team at Freshworks, and Pratik, who's a director of solution engineering at UPath. We really hope you walk away from this specific discussion feeling really empowered and prepared for the common challenges that you might experience in transitioning from individual contributor to leader. And I think it'll really tie in well to the rest of the content that we've heard throughout the week. So we have a great discussion planned. And I think we can just dive right in. So for our first question, I'd love to hear from the team on what the hardest part was on transitioning from contributor to leader. Let's start with you, Liz.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for hosting, Courtney. James, thanks for hosting session, and everybody who's here today. This is a super valuable information. So in terms of the hardest part of transitioning from contributor to leader, so when I moved into management, I had been an IC at Slack, and I was now managing peers that I had previously worked alongside. And so one of the biggest pieces that I struggled with, especially in the beginning, was imposter syndrome. Now, we all experience that in different forms in our careers. I feel like it's something that never goes away. But I specifically remember my first one-on-ones, like with the team. I was so nervous. I was so incredibly nervous. And this is coming from, I had already had regular one-on-ones with them as an IAC, more as like a mentor role. But it's just the power dynamic had completely shifted. And I was like, I hope they think I'm going to be a good manager. So just taking a moment to also acknowledge that fact, that one thing I will say is your relationship with your team will shift a little bit. There will be things that they previously shared with you that they won't feel comfortable sharing anymore. And that's okay. That's not a reflection of you. That's just how things shift. And I just wanted to set it aside, that happens. And that's a very real thing. But going back to imposter syndrome, I think one of the things that helped mitigate with this was just having confidence in my abilities, knowing that my leadership team was confident in me, especially going through the interview process. They put me through the gauntlet. So they had confidence in me. And then also on the other side of the coin, knowing when to ask your team for input and being confident that you can rely on them as well. They're going to have a different perspective, and taking their insight into account is going to be really important. And at the end of the day, it's really about giving yourself permission that you won't have all the answers. I mean, realistically, this is a brand new role for you. This is something you've never done before. So, you're not going to know everything.
I love all those insights, Liz. Pratik, I think you have a great perspective here too, so I'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say from my perspective, a theme you'll notice in some of the things we talk about today from my side are the challenges I had early on with time management. And I think it's easy being promoted as a first-time leader to really underestimate the time that you need to commit to different aspects of the job. Oftentimes as an IC, you think about the team, you think about your boss, but you might not think about the other areas. So the fact that there were just so many internal stakeholders I had to balance at once, frankly caught me off guard and took some adjustment. For my team specifically, there's my manager, there's all of my peers, obviously the folks on the team. And then outside of that, it's a sales role. So the sales team, the customer success team, et cetera. So finding a way to balance all of that, I found to be very challenging. A couple words of wisdom I would mention there are one, finding the most effective ways to communicate. And while I love being on calls and chatting with folks, I've just realized it can easily turn into 20 recurring one-on-ones that I have on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So finding the most effective way to communicate, whether it's over Slack, email, et cetera. And the other aspect is really just about making sure you're consistently prioritizing and focusing on the strategic priorities of your organization and finding ways to align. I'm the type of person who loves to add value. So with the number of stakeholders, the number of asks I got really skyrocketed, and I wanted to do my best to add value, but you have to be realistic about what you're able to commit to and what the team's able to commit to. So finding balance there from a time management perspective is very key.
Totally heard on the time management piece. I'd encourage anyone who hasn't stepped into a leadership role to creep their manager's calendar and just get a sense of how much is on there and what's on their plate. If their calendar is not public, ask them to take a screenshot, because it is quite telling. And it's, I think, helpful to understand who in the organization are they interfacing with, what is that demand on their time, and what are their priorities. I'd actually love to touch on something that Liz brought up earlier, which was that imposter syndrome. And this has actually been, I think, a recurring theme in most of the sessions today. So I'm glad we have some space to talk about it towards the end here. I'd love to dig into this just a little bit more. Liz, could you get us started in thinking about how you combated imposter syndrome when stepping into leadership?
Yeah, happy to do that. And I will say it's something that it's like, you definitely have to mitigate it. There is no like getting rid of it, I feel like. And the other thing is there's not any one particular answer. But the one important part that I think is worth talking about today, for me at least, was building a community. One of the things that not everybody tells you about moving into a leadership role is it can be incredibly lonely. The amount of people that you have that you can talk about your frustrations, your challenges, your successes is now very few and far between. And so you have to be really intentional about building that community. So having that core set of people is incredibly important. Not only when you move into that role, but also now in this world of remote work where you're not seeing people, you're not able to have those ad hoc conversations. So you really have to make the time for it. One of the things that I will say is it's not only about sharing what you're dealing with, but also hearing what your peers are dealing with as well. Knowing that others are facing probably the same challenges as you really helps, because you feel like you're not alone. You also, a lot of times you'll see their output or their team's output and different things that they're doing. And you're like, wow, they're doing great, like super excited about what they're doing. And then you talk to them and you understand like their internal challenges are the same as you. And you're like, okay, I'm not the only person who's dealing with this. So for me personally, I have 3 peers that make up that core community for myself. And we meet either weekly or every 2 weeks. And that's something that's really, really important to me, where we can talk about work and different things that we're facing there. We can just talk about life in general and what's going on, and really anything in between. A lot of times we'll talk, like I have one person who talks about Star Wars all the time, and it's absolutely fantastic. But I think the key here is just like, it's finding that community, and like, especially in this time, finding a belonging really helps, at least me, combat that imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I think having that community around you is so important. And, we talked about mentors in the last session, but also having friend tours, I call them, people in if you're on first line, also in a first line leadership role that you can connect with and share those struggles. I found as soon as I started doing that, I felt less lonely. I felt like I wasn't going through these things by myself. So I'm glad you've built that community. I would definitely encourage everyone else to. Ford, I know you have a perspective on the imposter syndrome topic as well, so I'd love to hear from you next.
Absolutely. And especially if you could turn a frenemy into a friend tour, I highly encourage it. Those developments are solid across your career. If there's anything you can take from this session and many earlier, is that imposter syndrome is totally normal. You should expect to feel it, regardless of the context of your particular leadership role, even how long you have had your career going on. There are going to be differences in experience between you and the people on your team. Ideally, you should seek that. Occasionally, you're going to have high achievers, either because you inherited them or because through hard work and collaboration, you developed them on your team. But those are going to be people whose talent screams out, why am I in charge of this person? I know for myself, that was the case over the first year of my management. About halfway through, I had begun working and leading a commercial solutions engineering team. We reorganized our sales staff, and I inherited a half dozen decades in enterprise experienced sales engineers, a job that I had never performed before. I would wear the mantle of that imposter syndrome until I realized that I was applying the same rubric for success for myself as an individual contributor to my role as a leader. And it wasn't even healthy then. The idea that failure was not an option. Unfortunately, it is, and it was going to happen. I was healed by, and I guess to Liz's point, you're never fully away from it, but what allowed me to mitigate and be effective even in the face of imposter syndrome was taking my rubric for success for my own leaders and applying it to my job. I have had the privilege of reporting to a collection of really grand, really great leaders and managers. And each individual one of them was self-aware and imperfect. They had wonderful strengths. They knew what they were. They leveraged them. And I managed up. I provided value that was complementary. And by not viewing myself with that level of clarity, I was robbing me and my individual contributors of the opportunity to build a relationship like that. And obviously suffering from having the wrong expectations for myself at the same time. So at the core of imposter syndrome is really that idea that you're inadequate to wield the authority that you have. I think that's a broken way to approach leadership from the very get-go. It's really a service. Appreciate that as long as you're removing obstacles from the path of your individual contributors and obsessing over their particular case, providing value there, you're going to be just fine. They're going to tell stories about you in the future about how great a boss you were.
I love those points. And I think Liz brought this up too, whether you're taking over folks that you contributed alongside as an individual contributor or inheriting folks from another leader that are even more tenured than you, that can create some discomfort and a level of imposter syndrome that's hard. But if we lean into what we learned from Garrett and Jeff, learning how to manage up and down, figure out how that person wants to be led, what they need from a leader, what they don't need from a leader. I think that can help start to combat that imposter syndrome because you know that you're showing up every day for that person in the way that they asked you or need you to, rather than a way that you might feel like you have to just given their tenure in the org. Switching gears a little bit, since we're talking about the first year of leadership, I'd love to hear from the group what lessons you learned during that formative first year. So Payal, I'd love for you to start us out here.
Sounds good. And I will say this much. I think there were a lot of lessons. So I'm going to try to make this concise because I think your first year as a manager, it's an uphill traction and coming down that hill, I don't think it ever happens. But so the first one I'll talk about is I needed my own manager a lot. I'm going to be honest here. And I think we're all being honest here today and transparent. I didn't know what to do so many times. And it was probably all the time. So having my manager available, willing to help me, give me his opinion, and building that relationship with him was really important. I'll even give a shout out to him because I think I was probably asking him so many questions my first few months as a manager, and he was always busy but made time for me. So make sure you have that really great relationship with whoever your leader is in your organization. I'll also say I also over communicated with him in the beginning. I wanted him to know what was going on with the team, what were projects that my team was possibly working on. So lots of over communication because even though he was no longer that direct manager for the ICs, I wanted him to be aware of what's happening with the team so we could get ahead of things. The second thing I'll say I learned was every manager has a different style. And I was still creating my own style as my first year. So I leaned on my manager often. And even though my manager and I share a lot of similar qualities, I've learned over the past year that we totally, we approach things differently. And it's okay that we approach things differently. So sometimes, there isn't a clear right or wrong and so forth. So it's been helpful to have him to lean on, but he also identified that it's okay for me to go and make my decisions and learn from those decisions as well. So I think just realize you can mock for a little bit, but it's also okay to have your own style as well. The third biggest thing that I learned was mentorship is very different than coaching. So for all of those aspiring leaders, if you're a mentor today, it's so different when you have to put on the coaching hat as a manager.
before I became a manager, I mentored a lot of other SEs on the team. And when they came to me for issues or questions, I jumped to sharing my experience and giving the advice right away. I'd go help them solve their problems. But when I became directly responsible for the growth of individuals on the team, for me, I realized it had to be about taking a little bit of a step back, letting them figure out some things, letting them practice. I had to practice more of the coaching style because I didn't want to give them the answer too quickly. I wanted them to be able to figure some of that out themselves, but it's also a balance to help, as well. And then finally, I think it's okay to make mistakes or be wrong as a manager. We are all on our own growth journey as leaders. And when I first became a manager, I felt like I wanted to know exactly what to do, and I wanted to know what to say, and I didn't. It felt weird because I was an SE for so long that I knew what I had to come in and do every day, and I knew what to say, and I knew how to win customers. But it was different being a leader. So I think it's just like an IC. We all make mistakes, and it's okay because we're going to grow and learn from them. So try different things out, take risks as a first-time leader as well. So I'll end on that note. But yes, I could go on and on about this topic. But those are some of the tips that I'll share.
Those themes all resonate with me so much, especially giving yourself like the space and almost the permission to make a mistake. I was told actually very early on in my career, even before I stepped into leadership, in most of our jobs, we're not doing brain surgery. There are some people that are doing brain surgery or other like life-changing, life-threatening situations. But for the most part, what we're doing, if we make a mistake, it's going to be okay. We can fix it. And reminding yourself as a leader of that every day is so important, to give yourself that space to try new things, embrace discomfort, and continue growing. Pratik, I know you have a few other lessons to share. Let's hear them.
Yeah, absolutely. From my perspective, two major areas of focus for me and things that I learned about quite a bit were the importance of both communication and delegation. On the side of communication, for those of you that don't know about UiPath, I think it's fair to characterize us as a hypergrowth startup. And as a result, we've had our good times and bad over the last few years. 2 weeks into the job, we actually had a riff. And I was a first-time manager trying to kind of manage turbulence through that time, not knowing exactly what was going on. And if you fast forward today, we're a pre-IPO company, a lot of awesome things happening, and just making sure the team's focused can be a challenge. So making sure that you're there for the team, consistently communicating and being able to prioritize in those moments is key. To the points made earlier, you won't always have the answers to every single question that's asked, but having that constant presence I found to be very, very important. The other aspect I'll mention is delegation. And it's funny because in the last performance review I had before I was promoted, I remember my manager at the time, who at that point, he was a first-time manager as well, telling me about the importance of delegation and how I might have some micromanaging tendencies. And I didn't really think about it all that much at the time, but I learned the lesson very well in my first 6 months because I've realized how important it is to flex to the different styles of the folks on the team. You'll have some folks who need consistent direction, and maybe that's a growth area for them, but you want to make sure that you're clearly communicating requirements and tracking progress over time with check-ins to make sure they're comfortable, because at the end of the day, if you're delegating a task, you need to make sure you're accountable for the result at the end of the day. On the other end of the spectrum, there's folks who are more tenured and have more experience, and their personal preference is to have more of a driver's seat in that situation. So in those cases, if I was to treat them with the attention that I mentioned with the previous group, they might see it as micromanaging. So making sure you can understand the stylistic preferences and backgrounds of different folks on the team and treat them accordingly to ensure that you can maximize the results from a delegation perspective was another major learning opportunity for me.
I love that you brought up, again, flexing to both the needs, tenure, and kind of learning and working style of each team member. And, Ford mentioned this too about like you've got some highly tenured folks, maybe some brand new folks, figuring out how each of them needs to be led so that you are doing more of that leading versus micromanaging is so important. So we have one more planned question for today, but I think we got some great Q&A from the audience too that we might be able to get to, I'm hoping. But for our last, at least planned question today, I know there's probably a ton of advice that we could give all the aspiring leaders on the line as they think about making a step like this. But I'd love to hear some specific advice from you all. Starting with Payal, what advice would you give aspiring pre-sales leaders?
Sure. This is going to sound very basic, but the first piece of advice I'm going to give is start to communicate to individuals in your organization earlier on that you actually want to get into management. I feel like there's many people that don't communicate this earlier on in their career. And on top of that, build a community inside of your organization that will support that career journey and growth. So biggest thing you can do, I think there's a lot of us that don't do this often. If you want a role, you have to go ask for it. And it starts with your manager, right? Be very transparent, have those honest conversations. On top of that, try to find ways to build a case on why you should be considered for that role. First-time management is very difficult to get into. And at times, what can happen is companies will go outside and you want to build that case for yourself within the organization and you want to ensure that you've taken the right steps. So my next piece of advice is act like a leader before you become one, right? There's a lot you can do to prepare yourself before you actually move into a new position as a leader. It's important that you take on the initiative for your growth and development. So always ask your manager what I can do. Here's some tips that I took away when I was wanting to become a leader. One is show you that you care about the business. Lean into projects that are outside of your typical realm. You find, for example, I'm at a startup. If I find a process that is just needing improvement, I will go reach out to the business stakeholder or the leader and say, hey, I'm noticing this problem. Can I go help solve this? I want to impact the business. I want to make the business better. The second thing you should do is mentor more than you ever have. Every time you mentor somebody, you learn something new. That's going to help you coach your future team one day as you get to that as well. So show leadership that you have the ability to guide individuals and you care about their success as well of these individuals. It also gives you that ability to learn all those different coaching styles that are out there. Go play around with that while you're mentoring versus when you get into the role and then have to go figure it out. And then finally, I love this part. At my organization, we have a panel when we interview. So I was always a part of the hiring process. And I cannot tell you how helpful this was for me because as a first-time leader, I think the first thing my boss said is, oh, you have a bunch of open recs, you got to go hire. And I don't know if I would have been as successful if I didn't know what that process looked like and I was a part of it to understand what is good talent, what are the right questions to ask to make sure I'm bringing in the right individuals into the organization. And the last note I'll leave, so other than acting a lot like a leader before you become one, is finally, I think there is this empathetic, humble mindset that is needed for all leaders. And many organizations or many leaders strive to be this person, but if you can start this journey of becoming an empathetic leader, it's the soft skills that are really hard to have sometimes, being able to understand someone when you're speaking to them, reading their emotions, their experiences, and trying to gauge. Every time you have a one-on-one, it's you're kind of doing therapy in a way. So if you can get better at that empathetic, humble mindset, then you can understand where that individual is coming from and truly impact them and help them grow. So those are some of the things I'd give for aspiring leaders.
Yeah, that emotional intelligence point is so key. And I do think some one-on-ones can turn into therapy or event sessions. And you want to give your people that space where they can come to you with their problems, but also help them solve them at the same time. And we're all SEs, right? So we're all solutioning all the time. And so letting your people know that they can do that with you and that you're going to help and support them and challenge them and gut check them and all of those other things is so crucial. Ford, what other advice would you give aspiring leaders?
Well, I would begin by focusing on that aspiring part. A lot of people have told you to start leading before you have the title. You're here at Leadership Next. Obviously, you've bought into that concept. Kelly led a fantastic session earlier today that really got into the root of whether management and leadership is right for you. Spend time with that question. Incorporate mentors into that initial decision to seek leadership. Heather, Vanessa, and Amanda gave great tips in the session before this on just that discipline. take that advice, allow it to incorporate with your own personal reflection, and you will be very grateful that you have defined your motivation for leadership before you get there. There will be times in leadership where you have only your own recollection of what are you doing there to lean back on for that encouragement and that dynamo of energy to keep moving forward. So that's my advice. Make that decision, spend time with it. But once it's done, that is the time to begin. I think you borrow the idea of creating a portfolio from the creative industry. Document aggressively the projects that demonstrate that you're thinking about the business the same way that your executives think about the business, appreciating fiscal responsibility, retention, the marketplace, all of those things. Demonstrate that you think that way and write down and document the activities that you've taken that prove that out. If you're fortunate enough to get a role at your company to go forth in leadership, perhaps the contributions that you've made will have made 80% of your case for you. If you go and seek leadership outside your company, you're going to be glad that you have hammered down those examples when it comes to the time to interview. So again, borrowing heavily from Pyle, because I think it's a really emphatically important point, is to begin your journey towards leadership before that role exists. You want to be ready when it comes to. And my advice for when you finally get the role, and this comes directly from my experience, is that people are inspired by leaders, not best practices or frameworks. I made the mistake in the first quarter of my year as a manager. I must have read 6 articles, podcasts, books, sought advice from other people. I packed my brain full of the ages of advice on leadership and management. And all of those things are good. You should seek growth. But the truth is, it takes time to apply any single one of those to your personal experience. They're written for a general audience. Reading Team of Teams is great. You need to understand your team and the teams around it before you can apply that usefully. The ideal team player, what does that look like in your organization? So I advocate having an information diet. Choose at the beginning of the week, the beginning of the month, how much information you're going to take in, and prepare time to reflect on it so that you as a leader can make the advantages of that knowledge available to your team. And finally, once you're not preoccupied with all that information, focus on being authentic. Make sure you uplift the people on your team personally and enable them professionally.
I really wish I could get into a time machine and take past Courtney and put her in this panel and have her hear all of these insights. This is so valuable. Thank you all so much. I think we have time for one audience question. I'd love to hear from any of you what resources helped you in that first year. Was it specific podcasts, books that you've read, communities that you tapped into? What kind of helped you build up your leadership chops in those first couple of months?
I would say for me, one of the things, the podcast that I listened to a lot, even getting ready for the leadership position, was a podcast called Coaching for Leaders by Dave Stachowiak. Goes through any and all types of scenarios that you would be a part of, and it really gets you thinking about what you would do in certain scenarios and how to think about things. So I highly recommend that, as well as one of the books that I think really changed my leadership style and how I thought about how to be a good manager to my team. It's a book called Multipliers by Liz Wiseman. It just talks about how your idea of being a good leader and like protecting your team probably isn't what's good for them. And really having that sit with me, I think, or early on, really, really helped me be successful this past year.
I can say Multipliers is a fantastic book. In keeping with my theme of internalizing and contextualizing wisdom, I like things that are wrapped in a story. So I really enjoyed the book. The Pentagon Wars was a very interesting depiction of how to navigate a bureaucracy and create effective change. I also, and don't call me presumptuous, I promise it's helpful, the presidential podcast from the Washington Post and New England Public Media talks about a lot of American history and useful leadership distillations from that body of work as well.
I'll share one more if we have time, Courtney.
Yeah.
As a first-time manager, I'm like of this mindset where I want to build an amazing team because that's what I love. I love bringing in talent. So my favorite book right now has been The Ideal Team Player by Patrick, I'm probably saying his last name wrong, Lencioni. But the book talks about what are the qualities that are needed. And it's all about building a team of individuals. And in solution engineering, you really need a team. No one SD knows everything. So the ability to build an amazing team that can collaborate and help one another out, like that's the culture we've built at our organization. And I think it's really important to know what qualities to look out for. So anybody that wants to go read this book, it also helps with personality traits as you're looking through the hiring process as well. So it's a great one that I lean on often.
Those are great resources, and we'll be sure to link them afterwards so everyone can find them and tap into them. I'll plug one more. In addition to all of the great resources that we've shared today and that are present in the PreSales Collective, there is also a leadership component of the PreSales Collective as well. We'll share resources after that. I know James will talk about it, but it's another opportunity to network similar to how we are today, talking about leadership challenges and helping each other solution like we've been talking about. Thank you all so much for spending some time with us today, imparting your wisdom, sharing these resources and best practices for folks thinking about or just stepping into leadership. I've learned a ton and I've been in leadership for a little bit. So I think this is extremely helpful and impactful. And I very much appreciate you being with us.